Hi there, this is Ronnie, coming at you with a video. I've seen a couple of videos lately with regards to board games, especially historical board games, and whether or not those board games are, by their very nature, sanitizing history. Whether by looking at a particular time in history from a particular angle, that the game is ignoring or minimizing other aspects of what was going on at that time, or, as I say, sanitizing, making the whole point of the game a lot cleaner, easier to swallow than was actually the case at the actual time. And do board games have a responsibility to history and its viewing of history to be more real? And it would be very simple if there was a simple yes or no answer to this, but the fact is, it's not simple. And it's not simple because part of understanding any period of history is to understand that we will never fully comprehend the horror of a given period. I'll give you some examples from games I own. One game I own is a cooperative game called Freedom: The Underground Railroad, which the players are working together as abolitionists, helping to free slaves from the southern states from plantations in the southern states of America, and get them north to Canada, whilst trying to using money and influence to gain support to hopefully bring about the end of the slave trade. Another game I have is Memoir 44, which is, albeit a board game, it is a war game set during World War II. And I have a few sort of conquest games. I will be doing reviews of a lot of these games in the upcoming months. And I will probably make these points again. And I'm someone who has played historical war games for many years. And have played a lot of games set in parts of our own history. And one of the reasons there is a disconnect, there's several reasons actually, but one of them is, if I'm playing Freedom, I can understand on an intellectual level the complexities of trying to bring about the end of slavery. The mammoth task of trying to change the mindset of a nation, and the fact that it had to be done on multiple fronts. You're trying to sort of grease the wheels with businesses, you're trying to influence governments, and also you're trying to help uh, aid slaves who go on the run to get north to freedom. And as an intellectual, tactical exercise, I can look at that. But I've never been in those shoes. Not in real life. And that's the point. There is a level of fear, of danger, of terror, horror, call it what you will, that those people went through that we will never go through in that game. There might be stuff in real life, but in that game, we will never go through that. Playing a war game, you can play it with a sort of a very clean and sanitized, purely intellectual exercise of tactics. But I've never been a soldier, fighter pilot, Navy. I have no idea on a sort of visceral, emotional level what it would be like to be in a situation where death could happen at any moment. Where any moment you could be placed in a kill or be killed environment. I've not marched through the mud and the rain and the cold. I've not suffered that fatigue and then having to go into a battle. I've not had to see the horrors of war with my own eyes beyond seeing pictures on television or in a book. So there is a disconnect, an understandable disconnect, between the games we play and what they are presenting us with, and the reality of that. And I'm not sure how much of that reality you could place in a game. I am sure that there are games out there that absolutely try and capture that feet on the ground, visceral sensation. And even role-playing games try to do it as well, but we do it from the comfort of our chairs. We do it from the comfort of our imaginations. We're not in there. We're not in it. Hope to God to never be in that situation. And that is not to demean those who have been in that position. It's only to acknowledge that what they went through was truly horrific, and it is not something I would ever want to go through. No one would want to go through those horrors, not realistically. So I think ultimately games have to tread that fine line between acknowledging the past but also being a game. That a game is that mix of strategy, history, and mechanisms that you hope the formula will whip up into something that people will find enjoyable to play. If you want the reality of it, even something like chess. Chess is a war game. it's designed, it is two armies battling against each other. You're not capturing a piece. You're not capturing a pawn and taking it off to the cells. That pawn represents a human being, or maybe it represents an entire battalion or something, but it represents lives that have been lost. And yet chess is very sanitized, and has been filtered down into a purely intellectual exercise in tactical thinking. So should we change? I think there is a place to say that games that are looking at historical events should do so in the totality of a thing. We shouldn't look at war with some sort of sanitized view. We shouldn't look at slavery with a sanitized view. We shouldn't look at colonialism with a sanitized view. And I think games can certainly do their bit to provide more context for everything that has happened. I don't think, and before anyone says cancel culture or woke, go away. It's not that. It's about acknowledging history and acknowledging all of history. I'm involved in a Call of Cthulhu adventure. And it's a horror game, but we have touched upon the inherent racism that was prevalent in society of that time. The difference between racism then, 100 years ago, and racism now is that racism then was more accepted, more normalized, whereas quite rightly we view racism now with utter contempt. But I think board games can do more. Now, when I say do more, I mean bring context. But even those games that already exist, and I have to say, Freedom is a good example of a game that has a lot of context. Where it lacks is that visceral, emotional connection that isn't its fault, and it does do what it does very well, in my opinion. And I am very well aware that is the opinion of a white man in 2021 who has never been near, who has never had to been the subject of racism, never been the subject of slavery, has never had an ancestor, to my knowledge, who was a slave. I've never looked at I've never looked down the family tree. I have no idea what my forefathers did. But I think where gaming can help is not that we can look at history and say this game provides a clear view of history. They don't. They simply don't. They can't, because of the reasons I've already mentioned. But what they can do, and what I think I wish with teachers and so on would maybe use them more, is to use games as a springboard for a wider discussion. By all means, if you're talking about, if you're doing the history of the Second World War, by all means bring in Memoir 44. Or bring in one of the myriad of World War II war games. And play a game of it. And use that as the foundation, the springboard, to talk about war. I remember, slight tangent, but I'll come back. I remember watching interviews, quite recently actually, I was watching old interviews with two of the great sort of icons of sort of classic horror movies, Peter Cushing and Vincent Price. And they both said, it was separate interviews with different interviewers, and they both said very much the same thing, which was that they didn't believe that what they made was horror movies. In spite of everything. They never believed that they were horror movies. They believed that they were fantasy films. And the reason they both said that was for very almost identical reasons. That horror for them was man's inhumanity to man, war, intolerance and things like that. That is what they saw as horror. What they did was fantastical and over the top and dealt with mysticism and ghouls and ghosts and monsters and so on. That was all sort of fantastical stuff. Whereas what they saw as true horror was something far more real to you and I. The reason I went off on that tangent is just to emphasize the fact that where there is a true disconnect between gaming, tabletop gaming, even video games for that matter, and the events that they are depicting, is an emotional, visceral terror. And I refuse to accept the notion that anyone could walk into a theatre of war and not be afraid. It's simply human nature. I would be terrified of the person who could walk into a conflict without fear. Because to me that says they are either void of humanity or void of intelligence. They either don't care for the situation or they don't understand it. The only two reasons why, for me, anyone can walk into that sort of terror and not be afraid. But games can be used as a gateway to learning, as long as we don't assume that they are the complete solution, that they are part of our solution, not the whole of it, that they represent some of what we do, some of what happened at that time, not all of it, that we can take that sanitized version of history and say, right, now let's look at the reality. And I would like to see more of that. People not to be afraid. even if it's not directly placed in the game as a mechanic. But I would like to see more games companies, when they create games, particularly those that are directly set in a historical period, perhaps produce a second booklet. Have your rules, and then produce a second booklet that really talks about the history and place the game in its context. Because I think that would be a learning experience. And we can play the game as an intellectual exercise, as a fun exercise of our intellects, our strategies, our tactics. And yet we can still acknowledge that it wasn't clean the way the game is. We can honour those who suffered, because let me tell you, in any situation where someone profited, someone suffered for it. But I think it's a good. I think we can use it more, and I think it would help. I certainly think it could help teachers, schools, to provide that starting point for a wider discussion. Let's not sanitize history. Let's use games to teach the whole of history. Because I think we'll be better for it, personally. I might be wrong. I usually am. In spite of a recent t-shirt my mum bought me. But those are my thoughts. I don't have a problem with people who can play any historical game purely as an intellectual exercise. Because they're able to look at the game as purely an intellectual exercise. That the theme is flavor text to that game. And if people can look at it simply as that, okay. But I think there's nothing wrong with providing information to give the people who are playing the game, the people who own the game, you can the reality of the history of that game, the history where that game is set. A great deal of historical wargamers do have a great, can be very passionate historians, particularly for specific areas in which they have a particular interest in gaming in. You will get people who will play World War II war games, and they will have, you'll see on the shelves just stacks of books about World War II, and not just books about tactics and how a battle went, but anecdotal comments and notes and diary entries and thoughts of people who were actually there. So they do again, whilst they may not have been there themselves, they do accept, they acknowledge the reality of the history that they're just moving little figures around and playing in. But I would like to see more. And it's not about demeaning gaming or demanding that games be more real. Because games ultimately have to be fun or people won't play them. But I think you can have a game. As I say, Freedom, I think, does it well. You can actually buy as an extra, you can buy there's a school aid. Basically a book where you use the game to talk about that wider discussion. And I think that's what I'd like to see more of. I want to see more of that. I want to see more talking about history, more understanding history. There's that well-worn adage that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So let's learn. Let's learn the whole of history. Let's not talk about necessarily good guys or bad guys or have a skewed view based on our own nationality. Let's look at the facts. Let's look at the reality of life in those times, and let's maybe have an understanding that goes beyond pages of a history book or a board and some pieces. But the conversation can start from them. So that's what I would like to see more of. Sorry for the rather long video this time. Usually they've been quite short, but I wanted to sort of get this out. Thank you very much for watching. And I'll be back soon with another video.